Across the unforgiving expanse of the American frontier, a man rides alone, his shadow stretching long against the blood-red sunset. Once the respected heir to the mighty Cross Pine Ranch, Thomas McBride now finds himself marked for death, betrayed by those he once called friends. Framed for a murder he didn't commit, he's being hunted by the deadliest guns money can buy. But these killers don't know what kind of man they're dealing with. Through ghost towns and treacherous canyons, McBride transforms from prey to predator, turning their own brutal tactics against them. One by one, he's tracking them down, each confrontation bringing him closer to the truth. But in a land where justice comes from the barrel of a gun, can one man's quest for vengeance lead to redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Montana sky in watercolor hues as Thomas McBride stood on the wraparound porch of the Cross Pine Ranch main house, his father's pocket watch heavy in his palm. The antique timepiece had marked generations of McBride mornings. Just like this one, its gold case worn smooth by decades of anxious thumbs. Thomas clicked it open, more from habit than necessity. 5:37, right on schedule. Below him, the ranch was already stirring to life. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, where Cookie would be brewing his infamous morning coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe. The distant sound of nickering horses drifted up from the stables, accompanied by the metallic clang of Jake. Murphy's feeding buckets, everything exactly as it should be, running like the well-oiled machine his father had built over 40 years. Thomas slipped the watch back into his vest pocket, feeling its familiar weight settle against his chest. At 38, he carried more than just his father's timepiece. He carried the legacy of Cross Pine Ranch, all 5,000 acres of it. The responsibility sat as comfortably on his shoulders as his worn leather duster, earned through years of working every job on the ranch, from mucking stalls to mending fences. "Mornin', Mr. McBride," called Pete Hansen, the ranch foreman, as he climbed the porch steps. Pete had been with Cross Pine since before Thomas could walk, and his weathered face mapped every season they'd weathered together. "Crew's ready for the roundup whenever you are." Thomas nodded, studying the eastern pastures, where the morning mist was just beginning to lift. "How many head you figure we're moving today?" 200, give or take. Mostly yearlings, ready for market. Pete pulled out his tobacco pouch, the same one he'd carried for 20 years. "Though we might want to hold off on that sale until this water business with Blackwood settles." The mention of James Blackwood sent a familiar tension through Thomas's shoulders. The neighboring rancher had been pushing boundaries, literal and figurative, since acquiring the double-bar spread last spring. Latest point of contention was water rights to Cottonwood Creek, which had served both ranches peacefully for generations. "James Blackwood," Thomas mused, watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks gold. "Man's been here less than a year and thinks he can rewrite rules that were set before Montana was even a state." Pete tamped tobacco into his pipe with a practiced thumb. "Some men, Mr. McBride, they come west thinking they can buy tradition same as they buy land. Ain't figured out yet that some things out here can't be bought. They got to be earned." The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of sage and prairie grass, mingling with the first wisps of smoke from Pete's pipe. Below them, ranch hands were emerging from the bunkhouse, their voices and laughter drifting up like morning prayers. "Sally's got breakfast ready," Pete mentioned, jerking his head toward the main house. "Made those sourdough biscuits you're fond of." Thomas smiled, thinking of the ranch cook's legendary biscuits. Sally had been with them since his mother passed, 15 years ago now, and she'd filled more than just the kitchen with her presence. Better not keep her waiting then. You know how she gets if the food goes cold. Inside, the main house was alive with morning sounds and smells that hadn't changed since Thomas was a boy. Sally's humming from the kitchen, the crackle of the hearth fire, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. All as familiar as breathing. The dining room table, big enough to seat 12 but usually occupied by just Thomas and Whatever ranch hands happened to be nearby at mealtime was set with its usual morning precision. "About time," Sally called from the kitchen. "Was starting to think I'd have to send the boys out to fetch you." She emerged with a basket of steaming biscuits, her grey hair escaping its bun as always. At 65, Sally moved with the energy of someone half her age, especially in her kitchen domain. Thomas took his usual seat, the one that gave him a clear view through the bay windows to the ranch yard. "Wouldn't dare miss these biscuits, Sally, even if Blackwood himself came charging up with his whole crew." Sally's face darkened at the mention of Blackwood. "That man," she muttered, setting down the basket with more force than necessary. "Don't you let him get under your skin, Thomas. Men like that, they're like snakes, all poison and no backbone." As if summoned by his name, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, marking the approach of riders along the main road. Thomas recognized the double-bar brand on the lead horse even at this distance, James Blackwood, making his presence known before most folks had finished their morning coffee. "Speaking of snakes," Thomas said quietly, rising from his half-finished breakfast. "Looks like we've got company." Pete appeared in the doorway, pipe still smoking. "Want me to send him packing, Mr. McBride?" Thomas shook his head, already reaching for his hat. "No, Pete. Think it's time Mr. Blackwood and I had a proper conversation about the future of Cottonwood Creek." He patted his father's pocket watch, drawing strength from its solid presence. "Some things are better handled face to face." As he stepped onto the porch to meet his approaching neighbor, Thomas couldn't have known that this would be the last peaceful morning Cross Pine Ranch would see for a long time to come. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, counting down the minutes to a confrontation that would change everything. James Blackwood rode onto Cross Pine land like he owned it, flanked by two hard-faced men Thomas had never seen before. Their gun belts rode low, their hands never far from their holsters, not ranch hands, but hired muscle. Behind Thomas, Pete's pipe went quiet, the cessation of its gentle puffing speaking volumes about the foreman's unease. Blackwood reined his horse to a stop in a deliberately careless way that kicked up dust across Sally's freshly swept porch. He was town wealthy, the kind of man who wore a city suit to ride fence lines, his boots too clean and his hat too new. A rolled-up document jutted from his breast pocket like a declaration of war. "McBride," Blackwood called out, not bothering to remove his hat. "Thought we might have a discussion about that water rights document I sent over." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Since you seem to have misplaced your reply." Thomas kept his voice level, mindful of the watching ranch hands gathering at the bunkhouse door. "Didn't misplace anything, Mr. Blackwood. Documents right where it belongs, in my father's old file cabinet, along with 30 years of legal proof that Cottonwood Creek serves both our ranches equally." Blackwood's smile tightened as he dismounted, pulling the rolled paper from his pocket. "Perhaps you haven't properly reviewed the territory's recent administrative changes. I have here a new survey that clearly shows—" "I've reviewed everything I need to," Thomas cut in, his patience wearing thin. "That creek's been shared water since before either of us was born. No amount of fancy paperwork's going to change." "Oh, that." The two men with Blackwood shifted in their saddles, hands drifting closer to their weapons. Thomas noted the movement but kept his eyes on Blackwood, whose facade of civility was cracking. "The territory's modernizing, McBride. Old handshake deals don't carry the weight they used to." Blackwood stepped onto the porch, close enough that Thomas could smell expensive cologne, mixing incongruously with saddle leather. "I'm offering you a chance to do this the civilized way. My lawyers have drawn up a very generous compensation package for your water rights." Thomas felt his father's pocket watch pressing against his chest, a solid reminder of what was at stake. "Cross Pine Ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Blackwood. Not in pieces and not as a whole. Everything's for sale, McBride. It's just a matter of price." Blackwood's voice dropped lower, meant for Thomas's ears alone. "And sometimes the price of refusing a fair offer can be surprisingly high." The threat hung in the morning air like gun smoke, Behind them, Pete cleared his throat meaningfully, reminding Thomas that he wasn't alone. The ranch hands had moved. Closer, tension radiating from their stances. "I think we're done here," Thomas said firmly, taking a deliberate step back. "I trust you can find your way back to your own property. You've had enough practice crossing the boundary lately." Blackwood's face flushed, but he managed to maintain his cold smile. "I'd reconsider my position if I were you, McBride. By this time next month, that creek will be running dry on your side of the fence, one way or another." He turned on his heel, his boots striking the porch boards like hammer falls. As he mounted up, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Oh, and McBride, do give my regards to Sally. I hear her sourdough biscuits are quite something. Shame if anything were to happen to that old kitchen of hers." The casual mention of Sally sent a chill through Thomas that had nothing to do with the morning air. Pete stepped forward, tobacco pouch crumpling in his clenched fist, but Thomas raised a hand to stop him. They watched in tense silence as Blackwood and his men rode away, dust settling in their wake like ash after a fire. Only when they were well down the road did Pete speak, his voice grave. "That wasn't just talk, Mr. McBride. Those men with him, I've seen their kind before. They're not here for ranching." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already turning over possibilities. "Send Jake into town. Tell him to wire Judge Harrison in Helena. It's time we got some official eyes on this situation." He paused, considering. "And Pete, double the night watch. Something tells me Blackwood's not the type to wait long after making threats." As the morning wore on, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, like the first loose pebbles. Before a landslide, he found himself checking his father's pocket watch more often than usual, each tick seeming to count down to something inevitable. By sunset, Jake returned from town with troubling news. Judge Harrison was away on circuit, not due back for 2 weeks. The local sheriff, never the most energetic lawman, had been remarkably uninterested in their concerns about Blackwood's threats. That night, Thomas sat at his father's old desk, reviewing the original water rights documents by lamplight. The yellowed papers bore the signatures of both his grandfather and Blackwood's predecessor, their agreement witnessed by a territorial judge long since deceased. Looking at their faded names, Thomas wondered if they could have imagined their simple arrangement would one day spark such conflict. The lamp's flame flickered as a cool breeze slipped through the study window, carrying with it the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing softly in the distance, the steady tread of the night watch, the lonely call of a coyote far out on the range. Familiar sounds that should have been comforting, but tonight seemed filled with warning. Thomas pulled out his father's pocket watch one last time, its golden surface catching the lamplight. In its reflection, he could almost see his father's face, hear his voice sharing the wisdom that had guided Cross Pine through previous storms. "Son, a man's word and a man's land, they're the same thing out here. Lose one, and you'll surely lose the other." As he closed the watch, Thomas made a silent vow to both his father's memory and his own future. Cross Pine Ranch would stand, no matter what Blackwood had planned. He couldn't know then how soon that vow would be tested, or what it would ultimately cost him to keep it. The next morning arrived shrouded in fog, unusual for the season. Thomas stood at his study window, watching the grey tendrils curl through the ranch yard like ghostly fingers. Something about the murk felt wrong, as if the land itself was trying to hide from what was coming. The first sign of trouble came with Jake Murphy's frantic pounding on the front door. Thomas had just finished pulling on his boots when the young ranch hand burst in, face pale as creek stones. "Mr. McBride, you need to come quick, down by Cottonwood Creek." Jake's voice cracked. "It's Mr. Blackwood, sir. He's dead." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Dead? What happened?" "Shot, sir. Right through the heart. And there's something else." Jake swallowed hard. "Sheriff's already there. Him and a whole posse from town." Thomas grabbed his coat, mind racing. "Wake Pete. Tell him to gather the men, but keep them close to the house. Something about this." felt deliberately wrong, like a trap being sprung. The ride to Cottonwood Creek took less than 15 minutes, but each hoofbeat seemed to pound out a warning in Thomas's chest. Through breaks in the fog, he could see mounted figures moving along the creek bank, their shapes distorted by the mist. Sheriff Wilson stood over Blackwood's body, which lay sprawled beside the creek like a discarded coat. The morning dew had soaked the dead man's fine suit, and his unseeing eyes stared up at the hidden sky. Near his outstretched hand lay a familiar object that made Thomas's blood run cold, his father's pocket watch, its gold case smeared with blood. "Well, well," Sheriff Wilson drawled, his badge catching what little light filtered through the fog. "Look who decided to join us." He held up a piece of paper, an official warrant, its red seal stark against the white page. "Thomas McBride, you're under arrest for the murder of James Blackwood." "This is absurd," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear building in his gut. "I was at the ranch all night. Every hand can vouch for me. Can they now?" The sheriff's smile was ugly. "Funny thing about alibis, they don't carry much weight when they come from men on your payroll." He gestured to the pocket watch. "Especially not when we find your family heirloom right next to the body, covered in blood." Thomas's mind raced. The watch had been in his study when he'd gone to bed, safely locked in his desk drawer. Someone had to have taken it, planted it here, but saying that would only make him sound desperate. "You know this isn't right, John," Thomas said, addressing the sheriff by his first name, reminding him of their long acquaintance. "Blackwood was causing trouble, yes, but murder, that's not how we do things at Cross Pine. Save it for the judge," Wilson replied, but Thomas caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Boys, take him in!" Two deputies moved forward, but before they could reach Thomas, a shot rang out. The fog made it impossible to tell where it came from, but the bullet kicked up dirt dangerously close to Thomas's feet. More shots followed, and chaos erupted. Horses reared, men shouted, and Thomas found himself diving behind a boulder as bullets splintered bark from nearby trees. Through the confusion, he heard the sheriff yelling, "Take him alive! We need him alive!" That's when Thomas understood this wasn't an arrest, it was an execution. The shots were too precise, too carefully placed to miss. They were herding him, trying to force him into a kill zone. A horse screamed in pain somewhere in the fog, and Thomas seized his chance. He sprinted for the tree line, keeping low. Behind him, he heard the sheriff cursing, ordering his men to spread out. But the fog worked in Thomas's favor now, swallowing him into its grey embrace. He ran until his lungs burned, following the creek upstream toward the high country. The sound of pursuit grew distant, then faded entirely, but he didn't slow down. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating odds, mapping options. He couldn't go back to the ranch. They'd be watching it. Couldn't risk contacting his men directly. That would only put them in danger. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a pine tree, the full weight of what had happened hit him. Blackwood was dead. The watch had been planted. The sheriff was either bought or fooled, and Thomas McBride, heir to Cross Pine Ranch, was now a wanted man. He reached instinctively for the pocket watch before remembering it lay beside Blackwood's body, its presence there damning him more surely than any false witness. His father had always said the watch would guide him through dark times, but he'd never imagined darkness quite like this. A branch snapped somewhere behind him, and Thomas tensed. Through the thinning fog, he caught movement, mounted men working their way up the creek. Professional trackers by the look of them, not the sheriff's regular deputies. Blackwood's, hired guns most likely, making sure the framed job stuck. Thomas moved deeper into the woods, his mind settling into a cold, clear focus. He was being hunted now, but that wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later he'd turn the tables, find out who really killed Blackwood, uncover the truth about the water rights dispute, clear his name. But first, he had to survive. And to do that, He'd need to become something other than Thomas McBride, respected rancher. He'd need to become the kind of man who could match Blackwood's killers at their own game. As if to mark the transformation, the fog finally began to lift, revealing a landscape that seemed somehow harder, more dangerous than the one he'd known all his life. Or maybe it was his eyes that had changed, seeing for the first time the brutal reality that had always lurked beneath the surface of his peaceful world. Either way, as Thomas McBride slipped away into the wilderness, he left behind more than just his watch. He left behind every comfortable certainty he'd ever known, trading them all for a single burning purpose: survival first, then vengeance. The first night as a hunted man taught Thomas McBride more about survival than his previous 38 years combined. With nothing but the clothes on his back and the few items in his coat pockets, he pushed deeper into the wild country that bordered Cross Pine Ranch, keeping to the shadows of rock outcroppings and dense pine stands. In his breast pocket, he found an old map of the territory, one he'd tucked away the previous morning while reviewing the water rights dispute. Now, by the fading light of dusk, he studied its weathered surface, tracing possible routes with dirt-stained fingers. The map had belonged to his father, its corners soft with age, the creases so worn they threatened to tear. Penciled notes in his father's hand marked hidden springs, old trappers' caves, and long-abandoned mining claims. Knowledge. That might mean the difference between life and death in the days ahead. Night fell like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that reminded Thomas how unprepared he was for this flight. In the distance, he could see torchlights moving along the ridgelines, search parties methodically combing the terrain. They were being thorough, professional. These weren't just local deputies playing at manhunting. These were men who tracked humans for a living. Thomas found shelter in a narrow cave, little more than a crack in a limestone bluff, but it offered protection from the wind and couldn't be seen from below. As he huddled there, watching the distant lights, his mind returned to Cross Pine. Would Pete understand what had happened? Would he be able to protect the ranch hands from questioning? And Sally, God, he hoped Sally wouldn't try to stand up to the sheriff on his behalf. A owl's cry pierced the darkness, followed by the subtle sound of horses moving carefully over rocky ground. Thomas pressed himself deeper into the cave, hardly daring to breathe. The riders passed below, close enough that he could hear fragments of their conversation. Tracking west, but I tell you he doubled back. $500 dead, 1,000 alive. Blackwood's orders were specific. Blackwood's orders. Thomas felt a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. If he was hearing right, these men had their instructions from a dead man, which meant this whole thing had been planned well in advance. The murder, the frame-up, all of it orchestrated to remove him from Cross Pine Ranch. When the riders moved on, Thomas pulled out the map again, striking a match with hands that shook more from anger than cold. In the brief flare of light, he studied the terrain ahead. The map showed an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles north, near the head of a box canyon. If it still stood, it might offer better shelter, maybe even supplies. But first, he needed to leave a message for Pete. His foreman was no fool. He'd know to check the old signal spots they'd used during roundups. Thomas tore a strip from the map's legend, careful to preserve the vital details, and used the stub of a pencil from his pocket to write a terse message. Not what it seems. Watch the water rights. Trust no one new. T. As soon as there was enough. Like to travel safely, he made his way down to Broken Spur Creek, where a lightning-struck oak had served as a message drop for years. The hollow at its base was still there, protected from the elements by a shelf of bark. Thomas left his note and took a moment to scan the area for signs of surveillance. Nothing moved except the morning wind through the pines, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trek to the trapper's cabin took most of the day. Thomas moved carefully, using every trick he'd learned from a lifetime of tracking cattle through this country. He walked on rock when he could, used streams to cover his trail, and kept to the shadows of the deepening autumn. Twice he had to hide from search parties, and once he caught sight of a rider moving parallel to his course, someone skilled enough to almost pick up his trail. The cabin, when he finally found it, was more ruin than shelter. The roof had partially collapsed, and one wall leaned dangerously, but it was defensible. Only one entrance, clear lines of sight in all directions, and a back window just big enough to serve as an escape route. More importantly, beneath the rotting floorboards, Thomas found what he was looking for, an old cache of trapper's supplies. Most of it was worthless after years of neglect, but he salvaged a rusted skinning knife, some jerry-dried meat that was still partially edible, and most valuable of all, a box of rifle cartridges that the damp hadn't reached. No rifle to go with them, but Thomas knew how to be patient. Sooner or later, one of those hunters would get careless, and he'd have his chance. As he worked to make the cabin marginally habitable, Thomas's thoughts kept returning to the water rights dispute. Why had Blackwood pushed so hard, so fast? The creek wasn't particularly special, just one of many that crossed both properties. Unless... Thomas pulled out the map again, spreading it carefully on a relatively clean patch of floor. He traced the creek's course with his finger, following it up into the high country, then down through. His finger stopped. There, marked. In his father's careful hand, old Spanish diggings, gold. The pieces started falling into place. The creek wasn't valuable for its water, it was valuable for where it led. If there really was gold up there, mineral rights would belong to whoever owned the water rights. Blackwood must have found out, somehow realized what he was sitting on. A sound from outside froze Thomas in mid-thought. Boots on gravel, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Someone had found his trail after all. Thomas moved silently to the back window, knife in hand, map tucked safely away. The pursuit was about to begin in earnest, but at least now he knew what he was fighting for. As he slipped away into the gathering dusk, Thomas made a silent promise to himself. He would survive this hunt, turn the tables on his pursuers, and find out exactly how deep this conspiracy ran. And when he did, there would be a reckoning that would shake the territory to its foundations. Behind him, the cabin disappeared into the shadows, one more landmark on a map that was rapidly being redrawn in blood and betrayal. The man tracking Thomas wore a distinctive silver spur on his right boot. Thomas had noticed it 3 days ago, catching glimpses of sunlight off the metal as its owner followed his trail through the high country. Unlike the other searchers, this one hunted alone and knew his business. Patient, methodical reading sign that most men would miss. Thomas watched him now from the shelter of a rock outcropping, studying his methods. The tracker had dismounted to examine a scuff mark Thomas had intentionally left on a limestone ledge, those silver spurs jingling softly as he crouched. He was trail lean and weather dark, with a Sharps rifle in a worn leather scabbard and a Colt riding low on his hip. "Getting sloppy, Mr. McBride," the man muttered, running his fingers over the mark. "Too obvious, unless—" He straightened suddenly, scanning the higher ground with sharp eyes. "Unless that's what you want me to think." Thomas shifted deeper into his hiding place, impressed despite himself. This wasn't some common bounty hunter. This was a man who understood the psychology of his prey, which made him all the more dangerous. The past 3 days had changed Thomas in ways he was only beginning to understand. Necessity had burned away any remaining softness, leaving behind something harder and more primitive. He'd learned to move, like a ghost, through his own territory, to sleep in 10-minute stretches, to ignore hunger and fatigue. The land itself had become both ally and weapon, and he'd learned to use it accordingly. The tracker remounted, but instead of following the obvious trail, he turned his horse up the narrow game path that led to Thomas's position. Smart, too smart. Thomas eased back from his observation point, moving with the careful precision he'd perfected over the past days. No broken twigs, no displaced rocks, nothing to betray his presence. But as he reached the back side of the outcropping, a loose, Stone shifted under his foot. The sound was tiny, barely audible over the mountain wind, but the tracker's horse stopped instantly, ears pricked forward. "I know you're up there, Mr. McBride," the man called out, his voice carrying an odd note of respect. "Been following your sign for 3 days now. You're good, I'll give you that. Better than most men I've hunted." Thomas held perfectly still, controlling his breathing the way his father had taught him during elk hunts. The tracker continued. "Name's Carson. Maybe you've heard of me? Did some work for the Pinkertons back east." The name meant something. Thomas had heard stories about Carson, a man who'd never failed to bring in his quarry, dead or alive, usually dead. "I've got a proposition for you," Carson went on. "Way I see it, this whole business stinks worse than a dead mule in August. Murder warrants too neat, too convenient. Man like you, respected rancher, doesn't just up and kill his neighbor without reason." Thomas listened intently, trying to gauge the sincerity in Carson's voice. The tracker didn't sound like he was laying a trap, but then again, men like him didn't survive by being predictable. "I'm authorized to offer you a deal," Carson said. "Come in peaceful, testify about certain matters regarding water rights and mineral claims, and this murder charge might just evaporate. What do you say?" Thomas almost laughed. So that was their game. Try to get him to implicate himself in some larger conspiracy before putting a bullet in his back. Kind offer. He called out, throwing his voice to bounce off the rocks, "But I think I'll take my chances." Carson's response was instantaneous. A rifle shot that kicked stone chips from where Thomas's head had been moments before. Thomas was already moving, using the techniques he'd practiced over the past days. Drop, roll, find cover, all while counting the seconds until Carson's next shot. The tracker was good. Thomas had to give him that. Each shot came closer than the last, forcing him to keep moving, preventing him from finding a stable firing position of his own. But Thomas had grown up in these mountains, knew every fold and shadow of the land. More importantly, he'd spent 3 days preparing this battlefield. Carson was so focused on the higher ground that he never noticed the carefully arranged rocks. Near his horse's feet, when Thomas kicked the trigger stone, the resulting slide wasn't large, but it was enough to startle Carson's mount. The horse reared, throwing off the tracker's aim and giving Thomas the opening he needed. He came up from behind a boulder, the stolen skinning knife glinting dully in his hand. Carson was good with a rifle, but in close quarters the weapon became a liability. The tracker tried to swing the sharps around, but Thomas was already inside. His guard. The fight was brief and brutal. Carson was strong and skilled, but Thomas was fighting for his life and his name. When it was over, the tracker lay unconscious, bleeding from a scalp wound, but still breathing. Thomas relieved him of his weapons, ammunition, and those distinctive silver spurs. "Sorry about this," Thomas muttered as he used Carson's own rope to bind him, "but I can't have you following me anymore." He left the tracker secured in the shelter of a shallow cave, with enough slack to work himself free eventually. Next to him, Thomas placed a canteen and some jerky. No point in being needlessly cruel, but he kept the silver spurs, tucking them into his coat pocket as a reminder of this first victory. As Thomas rode away on Carson's horse, leading his own mount on a long rein, he felt the weight of those spurs like a promise. They represented more than just a trophy. They were proof that he could match these professionals at their own game, could outthink them, outfight them, turn their own skills against them. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere out there, more hunters were coming, drawn by the bounty on his head. But Thomas McBride wasn't just running anymore. He had supplies now, weapons, and most importantly, information. Carson's saddlebags had contained more than just ammunition. They'd held papers, letters, details about who had hired him and why. Thomas touched the spurs in his pocket, feeling their sharp rowels through the fabric. The next time someone came hunting Thomas McBride, they'd find something very different from what they expected. The prey was becoming the predator, and the hunt was just beginning. Silver Creek wasn't much of a town anymore, just a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the mountainside like old grave markers. The mine that had birthed it played out 15 years ago, leaving behind empty streets and hollow-eyed structures that whispered of better days. But to Thomas McBride, riding in as sunset painted the abandoned buildings in shades of rust and gold, it looked like sanctuary. He'd found an old miner's journal in Carson's saddlebags, its pages filled with detailed notes about the area's hidden trails and forgotten claims. More importantly, it contained references to a man named Marcus Hawkins, who'd apparently stayed on after the silver ran out, serving as an unofficial caretaker of the ghost town's secrets. Thomas dismounted in front of what had once been the general store, his boots raising small clouds of dust on the weathered planks of the boardwalk. The building's facade retained traces of faded lettering, H. W.'s General Goods and Supplies. "That's close enough, stranger," a voice called from the shadows of the store's interior. "State your business or ride on." Thomas raised his hands slowly, keeping them well away from his borrowed weapons. "Looking for Marcus Hawkins. Found his name in an old journal. Said he might help a man in trouble with the law." A long silence followed, broken only by the mountain wind moaning through empty buildings. Finally, a figure emerged from the darkness. An old man, white-haired but straight-backed, carrying a Winchester with the easy familiarity of long use. "Might be I know something about that," the old man said, studying Thomas with sharp eyes. "Might also be I know something about a rancher named of McBride, wanted for murder down in the valley." He paused, rifle unwavering. "Question is, which story interests you more?" "They're the same story," Thomas replied carefully. "And I'm thinking, you already knew that, Mr. Hawkins." A ghost of a smile crossed the old man's weathered face. "Come on inside, son. Think maybe we got some talking to do." The interior of the store was surprisingly well maintained, with shelves still stocked with basic supplies and a pot of coffee brewing on a small stove. Hawkins gestured Thomas to a chair while keeping the Winchester close at hand. "Your daddy ever mention me?" the old man asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee that smelled better than anything Thomas had encountered since fleeing Cross Pine. Thomas shook his head, accepting the offered cup gratefully. "Can't say that he did. No, he wouldn't." "And boo," Hawkins nodded. "John McBride was good at keeping secrets, especially ones that might put others at risk." He settled into a creaking chair, finally setting the rifle aside. "We had dealings, your father and I, back when Silver Creek was still a going concern. Helped him track down some papers about old Spanish land grants, papers that certain parties would have preferred stayed buried." Thomas leaned forward, the coffee forgotten in his hands. "What kind of papers?" "The kind that proved the whole territory's original mineral rights were registered under Spanish law, not American." Hawkins reached beneath the counter and withdrew. A leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. "Your father found out that any gold discovered in this region legally belongs to the original land grant holders, meaning the ranches that were here before statehood." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. Cross Pine was one of the original grant properties, yes. Hawkins opened the ledger, revealing carefully preserved documents in faded Spanish script. "Which means any gold found on your water rights automatically belongs to Cross Pine Ranch, regardless of current territory law." "And Blackwood knew this?" "Oh, he knew." Hawkins's voice hardened. "Been asking questions all over the territory since he arrived. That's why I've been watching, waiting. Knew sooner or later someone would need to hear the truth." Thomas set down his coffee cup, mind racing. The water rights dispute. It was never about the water at all. Blackwood needed control of Cross Pine's claims before word got out about the gold. "Smart boy," Hawkins approved, "but there's more. Way I hear it, Blackwood wasn't working alone. He had powerful partners back east, mining interests looking to lock up every potential claim in the territory before news of the Spanish grants becomes public knowledge." Thomas pulled out Carson's papers, spreading them on the counter. "Like these names." Hawkins studied the documents, his expression growing grave. "These are some mighty dangerous people you're dealing with, son. Kind that don't mind adding murder to fraud if it serves their purpose. He looked up sharply. You know they'll be coming here eventually. Town this empty makes a natural hideout. I'm counting on it, Thomas replied, touching the silver spurs he'd taken from Carson. But first, I need to know everything you can. Tell me about these old mining trails, every secret path, every hidden spring. For the next few hours, Hawkins shared his knowledge, marking locations on Thomas's worn map and adding details that only a lifetime in the mountains could provide. As they talked, Thomas began to see how he might not only survive but turn the tables on his pursuers. As night fell, bringing with it the peculiar silence of abandoned places, Hawkins insisted Thomas take the store's back room for rest. Been keeping it ready, the old man explained. Your father helped me once, many years ago. Time to repay that debt. Thomas lay on the narrow cot, listening to the wind's endless conversation with the empty buildings outside. In his hand, he held the old miner's journal, its pages now supplemented with Hawkins's additional notes. Tomorrow, he'd begin using this knowledge, setting up the ghost town as both refuge and trap. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of gratitude for this unexpected ally and the fragments of truth he'd provided. His father's legacy, it seemed, was still watching over him, offering help from beyond the grave through old friendships and carefully preserved secrets. In the outer room, he could hear Hawkins moving quietly, keeping watch. The old man had survived the town's death by knowing when to stay quiet and when to act. Thomas hoped he'd inherited some of his father's skill at choosing allies, because his next moves would depend entirely on the truth of what he'd learned in this ghost town sanctuary. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with deceptive tranquility. Thomas stood at the store's back window, watching golden light creep down the mountainside, when Hawkins appeared beside him with a steaming cup. "Drink this," the old man said, pressing the tin cup into Thomas's hands. "But first, smell it careful-like." Thomas paused, the cup halfway to his lips. There was something off about the coffee's aroma, an almost metallic undertone beneath the familiar scent. "Poison?" Hawkins nodded. "Grimly, found the coffee pot tampered with this morning. Someone got into the store last night while we slept." He produced a second canteen, clearly marked with a recent scratch. "Only drink from this from now on. Can't trust anything else." The poisoned canteen became their first clue that a more sophisticated hunter had entered the game. Unlike Carson's direct approach, this new threat moved like its namesake, a snake in the grass, striking through subtle means. "Your father dealt with someone similar once," Hawkins mentioned as they carefully disposed of the tainted coffee. "Fella named Reeves, specialized in making deaths look natural, exposure, accident, bad water. Never left a trace that'd interest a circuit judge." Thomas committed the name to memory, adding it to his growing mental catalogue of enemies. "How'd my father handle him?" "He didn't." Hawkins's voice was heavy with old memories. "Man-like. That you don't handle him, you avoid him. Or you take him by surprise, which ain't easy with someone trained to expect trouble from every shadow." Throughout the morning, they found other signs of their nighttime visitor. A loose window latch that hadn't been loose before, footprints carefully swept away except for one deliberate mark left in the dust. Their invisible opponent was sending a message. "I can reach you anywhere." "He's playing with us," Thomas observed, studying the single boot print. "Wanting us to know he's here, but not where he'll strike from." Hawkins agreed. "That's Reeves's signature. Makes his targets jumpy. Gets them second-guessing everything. Most folks break under that kind of pressure, start making mistakes. But Thomas wasn't most folks. Not anymore. The past week had burned away his civilized hesitations, leaving behind something harder and more primitive. He found himself thinking like a hunter rather than prey, reading the psychological game beneath the surface signs. "Tell me more about the times my father came up against men like this," he asked Hawkins as they fortified the store's defenses. "Not just the outcomes. I want to know how he thought, how he outmaneuvered them." The old man's stories filled the morning hours, each tale containing lessons paid for in blood and cunning. Thomas absorbed them all, building a strategy piece by piece. By midday, he had the beginnings of a plan. "We've been thinking about this wrong," he explained to Hawkins, "trying to defend against someone who specializes in finding weak points. Instead, we need to give him exactly what he expects, but on our terms." They spent the afternoon preparing, making their defenses obvious in some places while leaving subtle gaps in others. Thomas wanted Reeves to think he was dealing with amateurs, frightened men falling into predictable patterns. As dusk approached, Hawkins suddenly went still, his weathered face grave. "Rider coming! Moving casual, like he belongs here." Thomas moved to the window, watching a man approach on a bay horse. The rider was well-dressed, almost dandified, with a gambler's neat mustache and clean-cut appearance. He carried no visible weapons, but Thomas noted how his coat hung heavy on the right side. "Marshal James Crawford," the man announced, producing a badge that caught the setting sun. "Heard tell of some trouble up here. Thought I'd investigate." Thomas and Hawkins exchanged glances. No real marshal would ride into a potential confrontation alone, without announcing himself to local law enforcement first. "Welcome, Marshal," Thomas called out, playing along. "We were just about to have supper. Care to join us?" The false marshal smiled, all charm and easy manners. "Don't mind if I do." They laid out a simple meal: beans, salt pork, coffee from their marked canteen. Their guest, who Thomas was now certain was Reeves himself, acted the perfect dinner companion, sharing news from Down Valley and asking casual questions about their business in the ghost town. "Funny thing about Silver Creek," Reeves remarked, declining coffee with a careful smile. "Town this empty, man could disappear up here and nobody'd be the wiser for weeks." "That's true enough," Thomas agreed, noting how the man's right hand never strayed far from his coat. "Almost happened to a friend of mine recently. Carter or Carson, something like that. Professional man went missing while tracking a fugitive. A flash of something. Surprise. Concern. Crossed Reeves's smooth features. Haven't heard about that. Recent, was it? Just this past week." Thomas kept his voice casual. "Found his horse wandering. No sign of the rider. Bad country up here for those who don't know it well." The conversation continued its deadly dance, each man probing for weaknesses while maintaining their false faces. When night fell, Reeves declined the offer of a bunk with practiced regret. "Best get back to town," he said, mounting up, "but I'll be around, keeping an eye on things. Never know what kind of trouble might find its way up here." They watched him ride away, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the gathering dark. Only then did Hawkins speak. "He'll be back tonight. Man like that never wastes time once his target's located." Thomas nodded, checking his borrowed weapons one last time. "I'm counting on it, but this time we know exactly what kind of snake we're dealing with." They spent the next hours in careful preparation, using everything they'd learned about their opponent's methods. Thomas found himself grateful for the poisoned canteen. It had revealed not just their enemy's presence, but his entire approach to murder. Near midnight, a board creaked softly in the store's back room. Thomas smiled in the darkness, touching the silver spurs in his pocket for luck. The snake had returned to his prey, just as expected, but this time the prey was ready, and the hunter was about to become the hunted. The night brought blood to Silver Creek. The confrontation with Reeves had ended decisively. The would-be assassin now lay trussed and unconscious in the store's root cellar, but victory had come at a cost. Hawkins caught a bullet in the shoulder, and dawn's first light revealed a more immediate problem. Riders approaching from the south, at least a dozen of them. "Time to go," Thomas said, helping the old man onto a horse. The wound wasn't fatal, but it needed proper care. "Head north to the mission. Sister Mary still running that infirmary." Hawkins nodded grimly, his face pale with pain. "Been there 30 years. Won't ask questions, neither." He pressed something into Thomas's hands, a worn leather pouch containing the Spanish land grant documents. "These prove everything. Keep them safe." Thomas secured the pouch inside his coat, then checked the blood-stained saddle he'd prepared for the next phase of his plan. I'll lead them away east, through Devil's Canyon. Buy you some time. That's suicide, son. Devil's Canyon's a natural kill box. Exactly. Thomas managed a grim smile. They'll be expecting me to avoid it. Makes it the perfect place to turn the tables. They parted without further words, Hawkins heading north along the old mining trails, while Thomas rode east, making his trail obvious enough for even amateur trackers to follow. The blood-stained saddle would help sell the story. A wounded man making desperate choices. Devil's Canyon lived up to its name. Sheer walls of red rock rose hundreds of feet on either side, with the trail threading between them like a snake through narrow grass. The morning sun barely reached the canyon floor, leaving it in perpetual twilight, perfect ambush country for either side. Thomas had studied this terrain on his father's map, but more importantly, he'd absorbed Hawkins's detailed knowledge of its secrets. There were caves up high, old mining exploratory shafts that offered hidden vantage points, and the canyon itself had a voice, a way of carrying sounds that could fool unwary listeners. He picked his spot carefully, a bend in the canyon where the walls drew closest together. Above, a narrow ledge offered access to one of those mining caves. It took precious time to get the horse hidden and climb into position, but Thomas knew his pursuers would approach cautiously. Men like that always did. The first sign of their approach came as a distant echo, horses moving slowly, men talking in low voices. Thomas pressed himself deeper into his hiding spot, Carson's rifle ready but not yet aimed. Patience had become his best weapon. "Spread out," a voice commanded from below. "McBride's through here somewhere. Probably bleeding bad from what Hawkins did to him." Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. Let them think Hawkins had turned on him, that he was wounded and desperate. It would make them careless. The riders emerged into view one by one, moving in a scattered formation that spoke of professional training. These weren't local deputies or random bounty hunters. These were hired killers, probably more of Blackwood's men. Thomas counted 10, 11, 12 riders. He waited until they were fully committed to the canyon's narrow confines before making his move. The first shot took their leader's hat off, a warning that transformed the canyon into chaos. Horses reared, men shouted, guns appeared in suddenly nervous hands. "Up there!" someone shouted, firing wildly at the canyon walls. The sound bounced and echoed, making it impossible to tell where the shots were coming from. Thomas had already moved to his second position, using the mining tunnels that honeycombed the canyon walls. His next shot wounded a horse, adding to the confusion below. He wasn't trying to kill, not yet. First he needed them bunched up, panicked, working against each other. A bullet spanged off the rock near his head. One of them had spotted his muzzle flash. Time to move again. But as he turned to retreat deeper into the tunnel, he came face to face with a 13th man who'd somehow flanked his position. The fight was instant and brutal. Thomas recognized him as one of Blackwood's original bodyguards, the ones who'd been at Cross Pine that last morning. They grappled in the confined space, neither able to bring a gun to bear, each seeking leverage against the other. Pain exploded in Thomas's side as the man's knife found its mark, but the wound brought clarity rather than weakness. He drove his knee up, creating space, then slammed his head forward into the man's face. The sound of breaking bone was lost. In the ongoing gunfire below, Thomas finished it with Carson's skinning knife, but the damage was done. Blood spread across his shirt, hot and insistent. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it would slow him down. And there were still 11 men below. Clutching his side, Thomas moved to his third prepared position. Blood dripped onto his saddle horn. No need to fake that trail anymore. Through the haze of pain, he forced himself to think. How would his father have handled this? The answer came with memories of old hunting lessons. "Son," his father had said, "when you're outnumbered, make the land fight for you." The explosives he'd found in the mining cave weren't much, just a few old sticks of dynamite, half-rotted but still dangerous. He'd placed them carefully along the canyon walls, where falling rock would do his work for him. Thomas took careful aim at the nearest charge. The rifle shot was lost in the ongoing chaos below, but the explosion that followed spoke with its own authority. Rock cascaded down, filling the canyon with dust and screams. When it cleared, the killing ground had become a trap. 4 riders were down, the rest cut off from both retreat and advance. But Thomas's vision was starting to blur. The knife wound burned like fire, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat. He'd won the canyon battle, but if he didn't find help soon, it wouldn't matter. Moving was agony, but he forced himself back through the mining tunnels to where he'd left his horse. The Spanish land grant documents felt heavy against his chest, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Somehow he got mounted, though he couldn't later remember doing it. The last thing he saw as he rode away from Devil's Canyon was dust still settling over the aftermath of his ambush. Behind him, he could hear the survivors shouting, trying to reorganize. But he'd bought his time. Hawkins would reach safety, and the documents were secure. Now he just had to survive long enough to use them. The blood-stained saddle horns swam in his vision as he pointed his horse north, hoping he had enough strength left to reach help before his pursuers regrouped. The morning sun was fully up now, promising another hot day in unforgiving country. Thomas didn't remember falling from his horse. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of hoofbeats and the steady spread of warmth across his side where the knife had found its mark. The last thing he recalled was the sight of unfamiliar moccasins approaching through the dust before darkness claimed him. He awoke to the sharp scent of burning herbs and the low murmur of voices speaking Crow. The pain in his side had dulled to a persistent throb, and something cool pressed against his forehead. Opening his eyes revealed a lodge's smoke-darkened ceiling, its poles gathering like spokes above him. "The fever breaks," a woman's voice said in accented English. "Your spirit is strong, Thomas McBride." He turned his head to find an elderly Crow woman watching him with knowing eyes. Around her neck hung a medicine pouch decorated with intricate beadwork, white for healing, red for strength, blue for spirit protection. She noticed his gaze and touched the pouch gently. "Your father knew my husband, Many Horses," she explained. "Long ago, when the boundaries between your people and mine were first being drawn. I am Swift Current." Thomas tried to sit up, but found himself gently but firmly pressed back down. "The men following me will not find you here," Swift Current assured him. "My grandson Grey Wolf has seen to that. He was the one who found you, half dead on your horse 2 days ago." 2 days. Thomas absorbed this information, thinking of Hawkins and the precious documents. As if reading his thoughts, Swift Current reached beside her and lifted a familiar leather pouch. "Your papers are safe," she said, "as is your friend who carries the shoulder wound. He reached the mission yesterday, told us to watch for you." She opened her medicine pouch and removed a small bundle of dried herbs. "But now you must focus on healing. The knife that struck you was poisoned." This explained the fever, the way his thoughts still felt wrapped in fog. "How did you know?" "The wound tells its own story. This was no clean steel, but a blade dipped in death's herbs." She crumbled some of the dried plants into a clay cup of steaming water. "Fortunately, we know these poisons. They come from our land, and our land provides the cure." Over the next hours, as strength gradually returned, Swift Current shared more than just medicine. She spoke of the old days when her husband and Thomas's father had worked together to establish fair boundaries between their peoples. The medicine pouch she wore had been a gift from John McBride, given in thanks for Many Horses' help during a particularly harsh winter. "Your father understood something many others did not," she said as she changed Thomas's bandages. "That the land does not belong to us, we belong to it. These men who hunt you, they are like the others who came before, thinking they can own what can only be borrowed." Thomas thought of the Spanish land grants, the gold that had driven men to murder. The lands caused nothing but trouble lately. Swift Current's weathered face creased in a smile. "The land is not the trouble. The trouble is in men's hearts." She touched her medicine pouch meaningfully. But sometimes what seems like poison can become medicine, if used wisely. Grey Wolf appeared at the lodge entrance, a tall young man with watchful eyes. He spoke rapidly to his grandmother in Crow, and Thomas caught enough words to understand that riders had been seen to the south. "Rest now," Swift Current instructed, gathering her medicines. "Tomorrow, when you are stronger, Grey Wolf will show you the hidden trails north, but tonight you must let the healing work." That night, drifting between sleep and waking, Thomas found clarity in Swift Current's words. He had been thinking, like his enemies, seeing the land as something to possess, but his father had understood it differently, as something to protect, to preserve for future generations. The medicine pouch caught moonlight filtering through the lodge's smoke hole, its beads glinting like stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pursuers to evade or confront, but tonight, wrapped in the ancient wisdom of these unexpected allies, Thomas felt his purpose shifting. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about protecting something larger than himself. Swift Current's herbs worked their magic through the night, burning away the last of the poison's fever. By dawn, though the wound still pained him, Thomas could feel strength returning to his limbs. More importantly, his mind was clear, focused in a way it hadn't been since fleeing Cross Pine. "Take this," Swift Current said, as Grey Wolf helped Thomas mount up the next morning. She pressed her medicine pouch into his hands. "It carries the protection of both your father's friendship and our people's medicine. You will need both for what lies ahead." Thomas touched the beaded pouch reverently, feeling the weight of its meaning. "I can't take your medicine bundle. You already carry it," she replied cryptically, touching the spot over his heart. "This is just a reminder of what you know, that healing can come from unexpected places, and that the strongest medicine is in knowing who you truly are." As Thomas rode north with Grey Wolf, the medicine pouch secure against his chest, he understood that he had gained more than just physical healing in the Crow camp. He had found a new way of seeing his struggle, and new allies in a fight that was growing larger than he had imagined. The first shot came at dawn, shattering a coffee cup in Thomas's hand just as he raised it to his lips. The sound followed a split second later, a sharp crack echoing off distant rocks. Even Grey Wolf, skilled as he was in the ways of the wilderness, barely had time to react. 800 yards, the young Crow warrior whispered as they huddled behind a granite boulder. "Maybe more. Using a new Henry rifle with a custom scope. I saw the glass catch the sun." Thomas touched Swift Current's medicine pouch, feeling its reassuring weight. 3 days of traveling the hidden trails had lulled him into a false sense of security. Now, the morning frost carried the scent of death once again. The shooter was good. Better than good. The specialized rifle scope lying beside Thomas proved that. He'd found it half-buried at an abandoned sniper's nest the day before, along with enough signs to know they were being stalked by someone who had turned long-range killing into an art. "Jacob Lang," Grey Wolf had said when Thomas showed him the scope. "Learned his trade in the war between the states. Now he hunts men instead of soldiers." Another shot kicked up dirt near their position, closer this time. The sniper was walking his shots in, methodically eliminating possible escape. Routes. Thomas studied the terrain through a crack in the rocks, noting how the morning light played across the landscape. "He's not trying to kill us yet," Thomas muttered, "just keeping us pinned while he moves to a better position." Grey Wolf nodded in agreement. "The sun will be in our eyes soon. He is patient, this one. Will wait for perfect shot." Thomas felt the wound in his side twinge as he shifted position. Swift Current's medicine had worked wonders, but he wasn't fully healed. A long-range duel with one of the territory's deadliest marksmen wasn't what he'd hoped for this morning. The medicine pouch seemed to pulse against his chest, reminding him of Swift Current's words. Sometimes what seems like poison can become medicine if used wisely. Looking at the abandoned scope in his hands, an idea began to form. "Your people know these rocks better than anyone," Thomas said to Grey Wolf. "Are there any caves on the western ridge? Places where a man might set up for a shot down into this valley? 3 good positions, Grey Wolf replied. Best one is called Eagle's Perch, old hunting spot from before the white man came. Thomas smiled grimly. Want to bet that's where our friend is headed? Over the next hour, they put Thomas's plan into action. Grey Wolf, moving with the silence of a hunting cougar, worked his way around to the north while Thomas made a show of trying to retreat south. More shots came, carefully placed to keep him moving in the direction Langer wanted. Just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, Thomas appeared to make a mistake. He broke cover at the wrong moment, running for a deceptively safe-looking cluster of rocks. A shot rang out almost instantly, but this time Thomas was ready. He pitched forward, rolling with the impact of a bullet that had actually struck the rock beside him, making sure his hat flew off convincingly. For long moments he lay still in the dust. Through slitted eyes, he saw a flicker of movement on the western ridge, Lang coming down to confirm his kill. The sniper was cautious, working his way closer in stages, rifle always ready, but his attention was fixed on Thomas's seemingly lifeless form. That's when Grey Wolf made his move. The young warrior appeared silently behind Lang's position, but instead of attacking directly, he deliberately kicked a small stone. The sniper spun with remarkable speed, bringing his rifle to bear on the new threat. It was the moment Thomas had been waiting for. He came up from the ground with Carson's revolver already drawn, squeezing off 2 shots before Lang could turn. Back! The first bullet struck the Henry rifle, spinning it from the sniper's hands. The second hit his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. "That was for the coffee," Thomas said, keeping his gun trained on the wounded man as Grey Wolf moved in to secure him. Lang's laugh was more of a cough. Should have known John McBride's boy wouldn't fall for the classic play-dead trick. His eyes were ice blue and completely without fear. "Your father used the same tactic at Shiloh, though he was on the other side from me then." "This isn't about the war," Thomas said, though he filed away this new piece of his father's history. "This is about gold and greed and men who think they can buy anything, including justice." "Justice?" Lang spat blood. "Boy, you don't know the half of it. Blackwood was just the local front. The real power behind this play goes all the way to Washington." Before Thomas could press him further, the sniper's uninjured hand flicked toward his boot. Grey Wolf's thrown knife caught him in the chest before he could reach what was undoubtedly a hidden derringer. Some men, it seemed, would rather die than face defeat. As they searched the body, Thomas found a letter that confirmed Langer's last words. The paper bore a government seal and mentioned something called the Western Resource Initiative, a plan to secretly consolidate mineral rights across the territory under federal control. "The poison spreads deeper," Grey Wolf observed as Thomas tucked the letter away with his other evidence. Thomas nodded, picking up Langer's custom scope and studying its fine German glass. "But now we know where to look for the cure." The morning. Sun climbed higher, promising another hot day in the high country, but Thomas felt a cold certainty settling in his chest. This fight was growing beyond personal revenge. It was becoming something that could affect every rancher and settler in the territory. The medicine pouch at his chest seemed heavier with this knowledge, weighted with new purpose. Millerton didn't look like a den of corruption. Its main street boasted neat wooden sidewalks, freshly painted storefronts, and even a small park where well-dressed ladies strolled with parasols. But Thomas, watching from the shadows of the livery stable, saw past the respectable facade. Too much money flowing for a town this size, too many armed men trying to look like ordinary citizens. "The bank is their center," Grey Wolf murmured beside him. "Every week men in suits arrive with heavy bags, leave with documents." The young Crow warrior had spent 3 days scouting the town while Thomas recovered his strength. Thomas adjusted his borrowed clothes, a banker's suit that didn't quite fit, purchased from a sympathetic trader, the ledger book tucked under. His arm completed his disguise as an Eastern financial agent, the kind of man who regularly visited Millerton these days. "Remember," he told Grey Wolf, "if I'm not back in 2 hours, I will send word to Swift Current. then burn the towns. Ammunition storage. Grey Wolf's expression was deadly serious. But you will return. The medicine pouch provides protection. Thomas touched the beaded pouch, now hidden beneath his vest. Then, squaring his shoulders, he stepped out onto Millerton's main street. The bank's interior was cool and dark, smelling of ink and money. A bored-looking clerk barely glanced up as Thomas approached, affecting the entitled manner he'd observed in real bankers. "I'm here about the Western Resource Initiative," Thomas announced, letting irritation color his voice. "Mr. Henderson's office, please. He's expecting me." The name, found in Lang's papers, worked like magic. The clerk practically jumped to attention, leading Thomas to a back office where a grey-haired man looked up in surprise. "I don't recall any appointment," Henderson began. "Obviously, there's been a communication error," Thomas interrupted, smoothly. "Washington wants a complete audit of all WRI transactions, immediately." The next hour passed in carefully controlled tension, as Henderson, too worried about his position to question Thomas's authority, produced file after file. Thomas made a show of examining papers while memorizing every detail he could about the conspiracy's financial structure. The ledger book revealed it all: payments to assassins, bribes to officials, the systematic acquisition of water rights across 3 territories. More importantly, it contained proof that Blackwood's murder had been ordered by someone much higher up the chain. He was carefully copying a list of names when a commotion arose in the bank's front room. Through the office's window, Thomas caught sight of a familiar face, Sheriff Wilson, looking much worse for wear since their last encounter. "Time's up," Thomas muttered, securing the most damning pages inside his coat. But as he turned to leave through the back door, he found his way blocked by a man whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide the gunfighter's stance beneath. "Mr. McBride," the man said pleasantly, "I believe you've taken something that doesn't belong to you." Thomas didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending them both crashing through the office door. Gunfire erupted somewhere behind him as he rolled to his feet and ran. The bank's back alley opened onto a maze of smaller streets. Thomas could hear shouts and running feet converging from multiple directions. But Grey Wolf had prepared for this, marking escape routes, with subtle signs that only Thomas would recognize. A bullet splintered the corner of a building as he rounded it. Then another whizzed past his ear, closer this time, but Thomas kept running, following the trail of markers toward the livery stable where a horse waited. He was almost there when a bullet caught him in the left arm, spinning him against a wall. The ledger pages spilled from his coat, along with Swift Current's medicine pouch. Thomas snatched up both, knowing he couldn't leave either behind. One contained the proof he needed, the other the protection he'd come to rely on. Somehow, he made it to the horse. As he swung into the saddle, Grey Wolf appeared from nowhere, loosing arrows that sent their pursuers diving for cover. Then they were galloping out of town, bullets raising dust around them, but finding no targets. "You have what you sought?" Grey Wolf asked as they rode hard toward the setting sun. Thomas patted his coat where the ledger pages rested alongside the medicine pouch. "More than we bargained for. Proof that goes all the way to Washington." He grimaced as his wounded arm throbbed. "But they'll be coming after us with everything they've got now." "Let them come," Grey Wolf said calmly. "The spirits are on our side." Looking back at the town receding behind them, Thomas wasn't so sure. But he had what he needed: names, dates, proof of a conspiracy that went far beyond one murdered rancher. The real fight was just beginning. In the flickering light of a cave fire, Thomas spread out the stolen ledger pages, his wounded arm throbbing with each movement. Grey Wolf had dressed the injury with herbs from Swift Current's medicine pouch, but some pains went deeper than flesh, especially the pain of betrayal that came with what he was reading. "Senator William Harrison," Thomas said the name aloud, still struggling to believe it. "My father's oldest friend." The incriminating letters laid out the whole sordid tale. Harrison had orchestrated everything from Washington: the water rights scheme, Blackwood's arrival, even the choice of assassins. The senator's elegant handwriting detailed it all in cold, businesslike terms. "Your father trusted this man?" Grey Wolf asked, adding more wood to their fire. Thomas touched his father's pocket watch, now recovered from the sheriff's office, during their raid on Millerton. "Harrison was there when I was born, stood as my godfather, gave me this watch on my 18th birthday, said it had belonged to his father before my father saved his life in the war." The watch's steady ticking seemed to mock him now. Every piece of his past was being rewritten, every certainty stripped away. "Here," Thomas pointed to a particular letter, dated 3 months ago. Harrison telling Blackwood about the Spanish land grants, warning him that my father had discovered their plan to seize mineral rights across the territory. Grey Wolf leaned in, studying the paper though he couldn't read the words. "Your father was killed by these men?" "No." Thomas's voice was rough. "Father died of fever last winter. But now I wonder—" He shuffled through more papers. "Here, Harrison visited 2 weeks before father fell ill, and look at this letter to Blackwood. The unfortunate passing of our mutual friend has simplified matters considerably." The implications turned his stomach. His father's sudden illness, Harrison's convenient arrival to help manage the estate, the pressure to sell water rights that had begun almost immediately after the funeral. "The old ones speak of a poison that leaves no trace," Grey Wolf said, quietly. "Brings fever, then death. The white man's doctors cannot detect it." Thomas closed his eyes, remembering his father's last days. The strange smell of the medicine Harrison had insisted on administering personally. The convenient way the senator had been there to guide Thomas through those first difficult weeks of running the ranch. "I was a fool," Thomas growled. "Too trusting, too respectful of my father's old friend to see what was happening." "No," Grey Wolf's voice was firm. "You were a son, honoring his father's memory. The shame is not yours." Thomas gathered the letters carefully, securing them inside. His coat. These, combined with the ledger pages and the Spanish land grant documents, would be enough to expose the whole conspiracy. But Harrison's position made him untouchable through normal channels. "He'll be coming to the territory soon," Thomas said, pointing to the last letter. "Wants to personally oversee the final phase of their plan, staying at Fort Larson next week." Grey Wolf's expression hardened. "Fort Larson is a fortress. Many soldiers, many guns." "Good." Thomas checked his borrowed weapons, then touched Swift-Current's medicine pouch for luck. "Means Harrison will feel safe. Safe enough to meet with his conspirators, maybe even put his signature on a few more damning documents. You plan to beard the lion in his den. I plan to finish this, clear my name, expose Harrison's crimes, and make sure no other ranchers fall victim to his schemes." Thomas's voice was cold. "My father taught me that a man's word is his bond. Harrison broke faith with that teaching. Time he learned the price of betrayal." They spent the rest of the night planning, using Grey Wolf's knowledge of the fort's surroundings and Thomas's understanding of Harrison's habits. By dawn, they had the outline of a strategy that might just work, if they could survive long enough to implement it. As they doused their fire and prepared to move out, Thomas took one last look at Harrison's letters. His father's oldest friend, his own godfather, had ordered his death as casually as signing a bill into law. The pain of that knowledge would never fully heal, but it had hardened into something useful, certainty about what needed to be done. The watch ticked steadily in his pocket, marking time toward a confrontation that would either end with his death or Harrison's disgrace. There would be no middle ground this time, no gentlemanly compromise. Just justice, served cold in the harsh light of truth. The mission infirmary was quiet when Thomas and Grey Wolf arrived, just the soft murmur of prayers from the chapel next door. Sister Mary, as unchanging as the mountains themselves, didn't even blink at their appearance. She simply pointed toward a back room where Hawkins sat propped up in bed, polishing an old military badge. "Took you long enough," the old man growled, but his eyes were bright with anticipation. Been getting restless, listening to these good sisters cluck over me like mother hens." Thomas couldn't help but smile. Hawkins' shoulder had healed well, leaving him with a story to tell and a fresh grudge to settle. The badge in his hands caught the lamplight, cavalry insignia, worn but well-maintained. "Kept it all these years," Hawkins explained, seeing Thomas's interest. "From when your father and I served together. Thought it might be fitting to wear it one more time, considering what you're planning." Word had spread through careful channels, reaching those who needed to know. Pete Hansen had already arrived, slipping into the mission at dawn with news from Cross Pine. Sally was safe, running the ranch with quiet efficiency, despite the watchful eyes of Harrison's men. More importantly, Pete had brought 4 of their most trusted hands, veterans all, men who valued loyalty over money. They gathered in the infirmary's back room as sunset painted the windows gold. Thomas looked at each face in turn. Pete's weathered determination, Hawkins's cunning, Grey Wolf's silent strength, and the steady resolve of the ranch hands. Among them, he counted 3 cavalry badges, testament to bonds forged long before this fight began. "Harrison arrives at Fort Larson in 3 days, Thomas began, spreading out a rough map of the fort's layout. "He'll be traveling with a full military escort, plus whatever private muscle he's hired. Getting to him won't be easy." "Getting to him isn't the hard part," Pete interjected. "It's making sure the evidence sticks. Man like that, he'll have protection from higher up. Military. Commander at the fort's probably in his pocket too." Thomas nodded, then drew out the incriminating letters. "That's why we need to catch him in the act. According to these, he's planning to meet with other conspirators inside the fort. If we can document that meeting, combine it with these papers—" "Might work," Hawkins mused, touching his old cavalry badge. "Fort Larson's got weak points. All forts do. Question is, can we exploit them with the men we have?" Grey Wolf spoke up from his position by the window. "My people will help. Not directly, the soldiers would never allow it. But we can create distractions, draw attention where you need it drawn." The planning continued into the night. Each man contributed his knowledge, his experience. Pete knew which soldiers at the fort could be trusted, or at least counted on to look the other way. Hawkins remembered details about the fort's construction from his army days. Grey Wolf added insights about the surrounding terrain that only the Crow people possessed. Through it all, Thomas felt the weight of his father's watch in one pocket, Swift Current's medicine pouch in the other. 2 different worlds, 2 different kinds of wisdom, both needed for what lay ahead. As the meeting wound down, Hawkins pressed his cavalry badge into Thomas's hand. "For luck," he said gruffly, "and to remind you that some oaths don't expire no matter how many years pass." Thomas studied the badge, thinking of all the history it represented, not just his father's military service, but the bonds between men who understood that justice sometimes required personal sacrifice. 3 days, he said finally, looking at each man in turn. "Get some rest, stay out of sight. When Harrison arrives, everything has to go perfectly." They nodded, understanding the stakes. This wasn't just about clearing Thomas's name anymore. It was about stopping corrupt men from stealing the future of the entire territory. Come dawn, they would begin final preparations for a plan that would either expose a senator's crimes or cost them everything they had left to lose. Fort Larson's walls rose against the dawn sky like a challenge. Thomas watched from a hidden ridge as the senator's convoy approached, dust rising behind a dozen mounted soldiers in crisp blue uniforms. In the center, a polished black carriage bore the government seal, Harrison traveling in style as always. Thomas touched the Crosspine brand that hung from his neck on a leather thong, Sally's parting gift, secretly delivered through Pete's channels. The iron was old, marked with his family's distinctive design, a cross within a circle of pine needles. It had marked their cattle for 3 generations, a symbol of ownership and belonging that now felt more like a badge of defiance. "Second, a gate's their weak point," Hawkins muttered beside him, studying the fort through borrowed field glasses. "Guard rotations sloppy, must be getting complacent out here on the frontier. Grey Wolf appeared silently behind them, moving like a shadow in the early light. My people are in position. When you see the signal fires on the northern ridge, the diversion will begin. Everything was prepared. Pete and the ranch hands had spent 2 days filtering into the fort town, posing as ordinary traders and travelers. Sister Mary's influence had gotten 2 of their men hired as temporary workers inside the fort itself. Even Carson, released from his bonds weeks ago, had agreed to help after learning the full scope of Harrison's betrayal. "Man's got to choose his own trail," the bounty hunter had said, handing over his carefully detailed knowledge of the fort's security. Hunting fugitives is one thing, but this conspiracy of Harrison's, it ain't right. Thomas checked his weapons one last time, not just the guns, but the carefully preserved documents that would prove Harrison's guilt. The Spanish land grants, the ledger pages, the incriminating letters, all secured inside his coat, but the most damning evidence was yet to be gathered. "Remember," he told his companions, "we need Harrison's signature on those new territorial documents. Without proof that he's actively expanding the conspiracy, these other papers won't be enough to bring him down." Hawkins nodded grimly. "Military commander's office is on the 2nd floor, north side. Harrison's sure to meet his conspirators there. Best security, good view of the approaches. And the hardest place in the fort to reach," Thomas added. "Which is why we're not going to reach it. We're going to make Harrison come to us." The plan was audacious, depending on precise timing and a deep understanding of Harrison's psychology. The senator's own arrogance would be their ally, his sense of invulnerability their weapon. Grey Wolf touched Swift Current's medicine pouch, which he'd been entrusted to carry during the operation. "The spirits are restless today. They sense blood in the air. Let's hope it's not ours," Hawkins muttered, but he touched his old cavalry badge with similar reverence. They watched as Harrison's carriage passed through the fort's main gate, soldiers snapping to attention. Thomas thought of his father's final days, of Harrison sitting beside the sickbed, offering false comfort while administering his poison. The memory burned away any remaining doubt about what needed to be done. "Sun's climbing," he said finally. "Time to move. Grey Wolf, get word to your people. We'll need those signal fires within the hour. Hawkins, find Carson and make sure he's ready with the backup plan." As his companions melted away into the landscape, Thomas took one last look at the fort. Somewhere inside those walls, his godfather was settling in, probably enjoying a civilized breakfast while plotting to steal land from honest ranchers. The man who had betrayed friendship, murdered his closest ally, and ordered his godson's death, was about to learn that some betrayals carried a price too high for even a senator to pay. Thomas touched the brand around his neck, feeling the rough iron against his skin. By sunset, either Harrison's crimes would be exposed to the world, or the Crosspine brand would mark nothing but a dead man's futile quest for justice. Either way, there would be no more running. The plan worked almost too perfectly. As signal fires blazed on the northern ridge and Grey Wolf's people created their diversion, Harrison did exactly what Thomas predicted. He fled the fort for the imagined safety of Crosspine Ranch, taking only his most trusted men. Thomas waited in his father's study, his father's gun in his hand. The weapon was an old Colt, worn smooth by years of use, its grip polished by 3 generations of McBride hands. He'd recovered it from its hiding place beneath the study floorboards, where Sally had kept it safe during his absence. "He's coming," Pete's voice carried softly from the hallway. Riding hard, 6 men with him. Thomas heard the thunder of hooves in the ranch yard, followed by the sharp commands of men used to being obeyed. Then footsteps on the porch, the front door crashing open, and finally, almost inevitably, the study door swung wide. Senator William Harrison stood framed in the doorway, his expensive suit dusty from the ride, his face flushed with exertion and anger. He froze at the sight of Thomas sitting behind his father's desk. "Hello, godfather," Thomas said quietly, keeping the Colt pointed steadily at Harrison's chest. We need to talk about my father's last days. Thomas. Harrison's voice carried its familiar political smoothness, though his eyes darted to the gun and back. Thank God you're alive. When I heard about Blackwood's murder— Save it, Thomas cut him off. I have the letters, William, all of them. The orders to Blackwood, the arrangements with Lang, even the receipt for the poison you used on my father. Harrison's mask slipped for just a moment, showing something cold and reptilian beneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Boy, the forces behind this are all documented in the papers I recovered from Millerton Bank, along with the Spanish land grants that prove your entire mineral rights scheme is illegal. Thomas nodded toward the door. Your men outside are already surrendering to my ranch hands. Grey Wolf's people have the fort surrounded. It's over. The senator's hand moved like lightning, drawing a derringer from his vest. But Thomas had been ready, had known his godfather wouldn't go down without violence. The Colt roared once, sending the small gun spinning from Harrison's grip. That was for my father, Thomas said, rising from the desk. The next one won't be so gentle. Something broke in Harrison then. The polished politician vanished, replaced by a snarling creature of pure rage. He charged forward, heedless of the gun, hands reaching for Thomas's throat. The second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him to the floor. As he lay there, gasping, Thomas collected the evidence that would destroy him. The documents, the poison receipt, and most importantly, the new territorial papers Harrison had brought with him, already bearing his signature and detailing the next phase of the conspiracy. The territory marshal is waiting in town, Thomas told his fallen godfather, along with a federal judge who's very interested in hearing about corruption in the Senate. He touched his father's gun one last time before holstering it. Your days of poisoning good men's dreams are over. The new deed to Crosspine Ranch lay on Thomas's desk, its fresh ink glistening in the morning light. More than just a property document, it represented the first of many wrongs made right. The territorial judge had been thorough in his work, invalidating all of Harrison's illegal land grabs and restoring the original Spanish land grant rights to their proper owners. Federal marshals left with Harrison this morning, Pete reported, standing in the study doorway. Half the county turned out to watch them load him on the prison wagon. Sheriff Wilson's resigned. Seems he's developed a sudden interest in ranching somewhere far from here. Thomas nodded, running his fingers over the deed's embossed seal. The conspiracy's unraveling had swept through the territory like a cleansing fire. Corrupt officials resigned or fled, stolen properties were returned, and long-buried truths finally saw daylight. Hawkins had chosen to stay on at Cross Pine, his knowledge of the old mining claims proving invaluable as they began carefully. Controlled exploration of the gold deposits. Doing it right this time, he declared, the way your father would have wanted. Grey Wolf's people had received formal recognition of their traditional hunting grounds, protected now by the same Spanish grants that had saved Cross Pine. Swift. Currant's medicine pouch still hung in Thomas's study, a reminder of the unlikely allies who had helped justice prevail. The morning sun caught the Cross Pine brand, mounted proudly above his desk, its iron surface reflecting light like a beacon. Thomas thought of his father, of the legacy of honesty and determination that had guided him through the darkest days of his exile. The ranch would go on, its foundations stronger for having weathered this storm. Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of ranch life resuming. Sally singing in the kitchen, ranch hands calling to each other as they rode out to check the herds, the steady rhythm of a home returning to its proper order. Justice had been served, not with violence alone, but with truth and perseverance, and the strength of unshakable bonds. Thomas stood on the same porch where his story had begun, watching another Montana sunrise paint the sky. His morning coffee steamed in the cool air, served in the same cup he'd used that fateful day when Blackwood rode in to change everything. The simple ritual felt different now, more precious for having been lost and regained. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, keeping time as it had for generations of McBrides, but its weight carried new meaning, speaking not just of legacy, but of lessons hard learned about trust, justice, and the price of standing one's ground. Below him, Cross Pine Ranch was stirring to life. Pete directed the morning crew. Hawkins chatted with Sally by the cookhouse, and Grey Wolf's people moved freely across the range, hunting parties welcome now on the shared land. The territory was changing, old boundaries giving way to new understandings. Thomas lifted his coffee in a silent toast to his father's memory. The ranch would prosper, its gold managed wisely, its water shared fairly. But its true wealth lay in the bonds forged through adversity, the loyalty of friends, the wisdom of allies, the strength of promises kept against all odds. The morning sun caught the steam rising from his cup, turning it golden like hope made visible. Another day was beginning at Cross Pine Ranch, and this time Thomas McBride was ready for whatever it might bring.